with the affluent here. They did play. And interestingly enough, their expenses here listed for committees for the Grand Sire Archon.
This series is dedicated to Brother Steve Coakley.
No beginning, there ain't no ending, just on and on and on and on and on. It's all because they're so afraid to say that they're alone. Until our hero rides in on his saxophone. Or could you call on Lady Day? Could you call on John Coltrane? Now, 'cause they'll wash your troubles away.
The black identity crisis is at the forefront of white supremacy. For the last 400 years, so-called blacks have been spoon-fed their history by a peoples whose history only began with the destruction of theirs. Most assuredly, the color-based caste system of race we know today as simply white meaning European and black meaning African was not in play during the European takeover of the Americas. The color lines were significantly more blurred. The rise of the so-called white identity is truly an American construct born in the 17th century as a method of social classification for the purposes of distinguishing rights between Christians, Confederate Indians, and captives. Throughout the entirety of colonization, the terms used to identify captured Indians changed several times before the 1900s. This formulated methodology is at the crux of the contrived black identity in America. To assume the Europeans who sailed to the Americas under the Spanish, English, or French flag were not dark-skinned would be an asinine assumption. To assume the ruling families of Europe weren't dark-skinned or swarthy would be an ascertain assumption. Knew nothing about the Americas is an ass-11 assumption. To assume that all black Americans are a product of the transatlantic slave trade would be an ass-12 assumption. To assume that all skin folk are kinfolk is an ass-13 assumption. And to assume your grandmother was lying to you about having Indian in your family should get your ass slapped, boy. The problem with accepting institutional indoctrination, it tends to lead itself into pretentious presuppositions by those newly indoctrinated about those who aren't.
I spent $100 to find out I'm black. That shit said 77% African, 13% European, and there was some miscellaneous shit. I was like, oh, yeah, that's a slave. Yep. Yep, that's a fucking slave right there. Wasn't no Indian in that motherfucker. Anybody here that's black, you know, we've been told when we was growing up that we had Indian in our family. I got my results. I called my grandmother immediately. I said, you a lying motherfucker. No goddamn Indian. Like, when the fuck was niggas and natives hanging out?
I got my results. I called my grandmother immediately. I said, you a lying motherfucker.
The two distinct lines in the sands of deception for black America were first Christianity and then education. At the foundation of both was the master plan of the colonizer to divide the black masses into opposing factions for the purposes of puppeteering movements and perpetrating conformity within the collective psyche of the black masses.
Or could you call on Lady Day? Could you call on John Coltrane? Now, 'cause they'll
At the pinnacle of the so-called black hierarchy in the early stages of American inception were indeed Freemasons. This list consists of the most prominent blacks involved in the establishment of nearly all African Methodist Episcopal churches throughout the entire United States. Masonic membership was a precursor to prominence for blacks seeking influence and power. The ranks of Masonic credibility, however, would soon divide these blacks from white Freemasons with the creation of the Prince Hall Lodge in 1784. Until this point, blacks were included in membership along with other Masons, as many of the founding members had earned their Masonic degrees abroad, but American lodges were far less willing for acceptance.
Long as I have my clams, I don't give a damn about muddy water.
The black experience in America during colonial times did not entirely consist of slavery. Free black cities thrived, even in the South. Many of the places well known for being major slave ports were influential black cities. Two of these cities being Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana. In fact, by 1868, dozens of black Republicans ran for office in Louisiana, culminating in the election of Oscar Dunn, who, of course, was a Prince Hall Freemason. But who exactly was Prince Hall?
Long as I have my clams, I don't give a damn about muddy water.
There is no general consensus by historians on the exact roots of Prince Hall's ancestry, although it is commonly believed he was born in Barbados. Boule historian Charles Wesley postulated that Prince Hall was born into slavery and owned by William Hall, a leather tanner from Boston. But David L. Gray, another Prince Hall historian, concludes the official record of manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was unfounded. However, in 1975, in his book Middle-Class Blacks in a White Society, Prince Hall Masonry in America, historian William Marashkin states definitively that Prince Hall was a West Indian mulatto of free status, and that he and 14 other black men were first initiated by the British military into a lodge located in Boston. But the wicked hot Masons out in Boston didn't want any blacks in their frats. All right.
To echo such blasphemous nonsense?
As the narrative goes, these were the first black men to be initiated and accepted into an American Masonic lodge. However, shortly before the Revolutionary War, the men of Boston's St. John's Lodge, who met in the infamous location of Boston Harbor, absconded back to England, taking its Masonic lodge with them. On one of the most important dates in American history, July 3rd, 1776, Prince Hall receives a permit from the Grand Lodge of Ireland. But the permit was extremely limited. Under these restrictions, the African Lodge was not allowed to perform any Masonic duties or initiate new members. At some point within the next decade, Hall requested for a full, complete charter for his lodge, which was finally granted on September 29, 1784. Before the year 1800, Prince Hall had set up lodges in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, who operated under the charter title of African Lodge. Prince Hall Freemasonry would become the prerequisite for any so-called African American pursuing prominence in a white-dominated society. The Freemasons themselves are at the center of many conspiratorial plots against humanity. As stated in their own records, the society seeks to freely exchange intellectualism without the bounds of religion and politics. Quote, from middle-class blacks in America, prints all Freemasonry. Quote, as soon as men became Freemasons, they seemed to place themselves in opposition to both church and state. In the first place, Freemasons devoted themselves to the spread of knowledge in its broadest sense. Logic led them to the realization that their aims could be pursued only when free debate and the spread of knowledge were guaranteed. The preconditions for the triumph of knowledge were freedom of association, of speech, and of the press, the abolition of censorship by the state and the church. All of this amounted to a program for fundamental change and to the demand that authority would not concede unless it was forced to. As a result, when lodges stayed clear of politics, as they were supposed to, many of their members did not, and the order's reputation with the authorities suffered. Be that as it may, the political non-discourse promoted within these lodges would soon become the trademark of this society, as most prominent Masons in American history are in fact politicians. The Freemasons, along with other fraternal orders such as the Oddfellows and the Knights of Pythagoras, claim their organizations originally descend from the ancient mystery schools of antiquity. These mystery schools hail from the intellectual fruit of civilizations past, such as ancient Babylon, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Some historians say these societies can be traced as far back as the 2nd millennium BC. But it must be noted the entire history of ancient mystery comes from a people who themselves were responsible for the theft of said ancient mystery and knowledge, and repackaging it into a veil of Eurocentrism and Pan-African Darwinism. It's no mistake that the American Masonic lodges are coded in Old Testament names and parallels. This is by design. The hidden history of the Negro in the world can be found within the pages of Scripture. But Christianity only promoted a very limited fraction of the Old Testament. The Christian portion of the Bible is less than 20% of the entire King James Version. Illiteracy stood at the forefront of black Christianization. An illiterate Christian with knowledge of so-called Scripture could tell that the prophecies being fulfilled in the very first chapters of Matthew are complete red herrings. As the narrative of Matthew states in chapter 1, verse 23, quote, behold, a virgin shall be with child and shall bring forth a son. This is a direct parallel from the book of Isaiah, chapter 7 through 10. Which describes the child Emmanuel who was born before the Assyrian invasion. The verses of Isaiah clearly detail the experiences of Emmanuel, which differ dramatically from the life of Christ. The next two chapters of Matthew continue to misrepresent Old Testament prophecies concerning the weeping of Rachel and the prophecies of Jeremiah. Christianity stood firmly upon the legs of illiteracy and even laziness. Did Absalom Jones or Richard Allen read from Genesis to Malachi? And if they did, how could they have still been Christians? Truly at the heart of the black African identity was illiteracy and the hope for acceptance in a white-dominated society. The mindfuck is truly ingenious. Introduce the indigenous people to a book concerning their history in a language not native to themselves. But only through the lens of their oppressor shall they learn this book. This is why many people directly associate the Bible with Christianity, because they've never read the book for themselves. Christianity is to the Bible as the radio is to a car. That's why the books were divided into the New Testament and the Old Testament. The New Testament did not exist until 1456, just before the invasion of the Americas. The first Europeans claimed their rights to rule the Western Hemisphere under divine law. The popes of Rome signed several papal bulls affirming such, like Dum Diversas in 1452 and Inter Caetera signed in 1493. The papal bull of 1452 established the rights of Italian, Spaniard, and Portuguese houses over non-Christian people captured in war for the purposes of perpetual servitude. This doctrine was initiated before the discovery of the Americas, which means the first European explorers to the Americas had strict instructions: eradicate, enslave, and evangelize. This campaign was intentional and essential in order to maintain a common theme amongst invaders. The front needed to appear unified for maximum effectiveness. The symbol of unification between all of these houses was the cross, which in itself was familiar and esteemed by certain cults of antiquity, who historians say were most commonly associated with sun worship. In fact, the cross symbol had been used in North, Central, and South America for generations for various reasons prior to the invasion of Eurasians. For example, temples in Mexico have the exact same cross design used by the Knights Templar, found coincidentally at the Temple of the Sun. This establishes a well-founded parallel between pre-Columbian Mexico and the Maltese cross of St. Andrews, and both of their associations with the sun. However, the symbol of the cross in America has a far deeper meaning than just the worship of the sun, and most of this record was burned, stolen, and repackaged by the Catholic Church. The cross in Central America has been intimately tied with human sacrifice. For example, the Crux de Cusada, otherwise known as the St. Andrew's Cross, is an actual representation of two dead bones and is the badge of the god of death. Regular human sacrifice was offered to the sun god, whose symbol was the cross. This begs a provocative series of questions. Was the foundation of Christianity based upon the actual account of a ritual human sacrifice? And if this question seems preposterous, why is the cross so intimately tied to death? Just as in South and Central America, as well as the Caribbean, colonizing powers in North America used miscegenation to create a caste system of so-called Negroes as societal buffers between the ruling class and the subservient class. Mixed race people of color were used as house slaves, but even more importantly, they were used to communicate the owner's will to the slaves in the field. And if a slave needed to communicate something to the master, the mulatto was used as a medium to inform him of said needs. In this sense, it was only natural for mixed-race children, especially those owned by the elite, to be developed or vetted into agents of the ruling class. Of course, this is why so many of the so-called black leaders from American history were actually of mixed race, but could socially pass for white. And even the ones who weren't socially considered white surrounded themselves with white and often married white. Blanche Bruce is prominently known as the first African American to be elected and serve a full term as senator as a Republican in the state of Mississippi. But Bruce wasn't socially black. He was the product of his father, the slave owner, impregnating one of his servants. Bruce was educated by his father and even attended prestigious Oberlin College during the height of the Civil War. Oberlin College was an institution founded by Christian abolitionists who welcomed with open arms any well-to-do black in the country. Oberlin soon became a Boule hub. Graduates like George Boyer Vachon, supposedly the first practicing lawyer in New York City, definitely a man with strong black features. He married Susan Paul, who was the daughter of Thomas Paul, who was a prominent black Boston minister and Freemason. Other graduates include Mary Church Terrell, another mixed-race member of the black bourgeoisie of Memphis. She was a champion of women's rights, founding the National Association of Colored Women, or semi-colored women in her case. She was also a charter member of the NAACP. She married Robert Herberton Terrell, a prominent black lawyer from Washington, D.C., whose family was also connected to the white Washingtonian elite through banking and finance. As a young man, Terrell was the personal servant for Ulysses S. Grant. His connections brought him prominence, which led to his acceptance into Harvard, and later graduating at the top of his class in 1884. Oberlin College provided the setting for religious Christians to handpick and indoctrinate the future Negro elite with futile social liberalism. There was a well-established practice of propagating educated blacks as social justice warriors for undercover Christian or Zionist organizations in blackface or beige face. On the opposite end of the spectrum were uneducated blacks, being fed the idea that the only way for black improvement was a white education. This fundamental discourse resided at the heart of contention between competing classes of Negroes. While many well-to-do blacks promoted education as the great equalizer, lower-class blacks saw these people as stooges for the establishment and saw the introduction of institutionalized education as a threat to their long-held traditions. Furthermore, lower-class blacks saw the black elite as even more predatory than so-called friendly whites. One example of this is when Blanche Bruce became wealthy. He purchased a Mississippi plantation in which the black sharecroppers on his property worked in conditions tantamount to slavery. However, Bruce and his wife, Josephine Wilson, congregated in elite black circles, being lauded as heroes of civil rights. The philosophical dichotomy of consciousness was being manipulated from without. Alternative views of black progression were, in almost all cases, being perpetuated through various factions of the white elite. The ruling class knew that in order to gain the most control over the minds of the public, the ideology of black liberation must be manufactured in such a way as to gain the hearts and minds of the community to the point of creating and maintaining political sustenance. In short, to prevent disenfranchised people from creating their own movement for their own interests, their movements must be co-opted from the ruling class in order to sustain ruling class dominance. And the disenfranchised must be shepherded into certain lanes of seeming diametric opposition. On either side of the objective is an illusionary solution. Divided interests lead to divided people, and divided people are easier to rule. The people wanted leaders, and the establishment was fit to provide such, and the vetting process began. The Boule can be more accurately described as a proxy group for several other pre-formulated organizations, such as the Free African Society, and to a greater extent, the Prince Hall Freemasons. Yet, even more proxies abound with organizations like Omega Psi Phi, Alpha Phi Alpha, the Congressional Black Caucus, and even Jack and Jill. But no matter the group, Boule brothers seemingly in dispute were in reality playing for the same team. On opposing corners of the first major Boule battle of the 20th century were W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington.
I had begun to criticize Booker Washington, saying it wasn't enough to teach Negroes trades. The Negroes had to have some voice in their government. They had to have protection in the courts, and they had to have trained men to lead them. Well, all this together put such pressure upon Atlanta University that at last I resigned. I mean, they would have had to drop me if they wanted to keep the philanthropic gifts that were coming from the rich people of the North. So that I accepted an invitation to come to New York in 1910 and help the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
A philosophic chasm had become fomented within the psyche of the original Americans, and there seemed to be a geographical slant in its reception and presentation. The northern faction of social justice Negroes, the likes of Du Bois, whose platform stood upon the legs of integration and equality, and the southern faction whose platform stood upon the legs of segregation and inequality, the ideology pushed by Booker T. Washington, like Du Bois, was born of mixed ancestry, but unlike Du Bois, he was born into slavery. Although little is known about his father, according to the book Booker T. Washington, The Making of a Black Leader, his father was a white man from a nearby plantation, and his mother served on the Burroughs plantation in Franklin County, Virginia. In his book Up from Slavery, Booker tells the story of the great day of emancipation, tears of joy running down his mother's face as she explained how she had prayed her entire life for this day, fearing it may never come. Washington worked jobs in West Virginia salt furnaces and coal mines after his family moved to West Virginia, where blacks were free. Following his days in West Virginia, Booker T traveled back to Virginia, enrolling in Hampton Institute, a school funded by the American Missionary Association, which of course was a religious or Protestant-based abolitionist organization. Hampton Institute will become a staple of black higher learning. And possibly the first instructor of Hampton Institute was Mary Smith Peake, a member of the Hampton Black elite. Her mother was described as a fair-skinned, free person of color, while her father, name unknown, was an Englishman of apparent rank and status. Mary Peake is considered by many a pioneer of black education in the South. And as the legend states, Mary would teach reading to illiterate, newly freed people under an oak tree, which later came to be known as the Emancipation Oak. She was officially sanctioned by the Union Army to teach blacks during the Civil War. Another portion of her wages came from the American Missionary Association, who endowed her Brown Cottage, the first structure on the future campus of Hampton Institute, which would later be attended by Booker T. Washington. In 1878, Booker Washington entered Wayland Seminary, an institute founded by the American Baptist Mission Society for the purposes of training black men for work in the ministry. President of Hampton Institute, Samuel C. Armstrong, who was also a Union general during the Civil War, recommended 25-year-old Booker T. Washington to be hired as the principal of Tuskegee Institute. The initial idea for Tuskegee was not just to produce tradesmen and agriculturalists, but rather teachers of agriculture and trade, who would then go on to other schools, broadening their reach across the South. Tuskegee was founded as part of a deal between Lewis Adams, a Negro community leader in Alabama, and two white senatorial candidates. The agreement's details included Adams' influence over the black vote for the Democratic Party, and in exchange, funding would be provided for a school for blacks in Tuskegee. Adams didn't face this endeavor alone. George W. Campbell, slaveholder and senior partner of Campbell and Wright, the oldest banking and merchant firm in the state of Alabama, partnered with him to acquire the necessary connections to accomplish the Negro Normal School in Tuskegee, which would be located directly across the street from the home of George Campbell on the property of Butler Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And of course, Lewis Adams and Booker T were both Freemasons. The opposing ideologies of Booker Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois were at the forefront of the Negro movement dialogue in America. Booker T also ran in circles of the black elite and had lifetime friendships with the most prominent white men, including Julius Rosenwald, who donated generously to Tuskegee Institute, author Mark Twain, oil tycoon Henry Rogers, who also donated to both Hampton and Tuskegee, Andrew Carnegie, and William Taft, just to name a few. Although Booker ran the South in terms of popularity, he also was well entrenched in northern elite circles of influence. William Denslow quotes in his book that Washington was made a Mason at sight by the Grand Master of the Prince Hall Lodge of Massachusetts, with an additional source indicating H.C. Benford, Grand Master of the Lodge of Alabama, in whose jurisdiction Washington resides, granting him sanction and congratulation. In 1900, Washington created the National Negro Business League in Boston, along with his wealthy friend, Andrew Carnegie. In 1905, W.E.B. Du Bois created a group of his own to directly counter the influence being made by Booker Washington, called the Niagara Movement. Their platform, based on social equality with freedom of press and speech, as well as an end to discrimination, stood at odds with that of the National Negro Business League, whose platform was more of a compromise, in which blacks would not press for social or racial equality, but instead be allowed to participate in vocational trades and training and employment in a white economy while living separately without the threat of violence. The Niagara movement lasted less than 5 years due to infighting within the organization. They held annual conventions in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, Boston, and Oberlin, Ohio. When Booker T. Washington died in 1915, the Negro League continued to be headed by Robert Russa Morton, the man who endorsed the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiments, which led to numerous deaths of blacks in the Tuskegee area. The National Negro Business League is still in operation today under the name National Business League. With Booker T pinned down 6 feet, Willie started looking for new opponents. His most formidable opponent to date was a man by the name of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who also ran in elite circles of prominent white supremacists and Freemasons. Marcus Garvey is one of the most championed black leaders of the early 20th century. Born into a Jamaican family in St. Ann's Bay, his father Malchus was a stonemason, which earned the family enough to be considered low-level bourgeoisie. Malchus, however, was notoriously terrible with managing his finances and was unable to maintain his personal property, which he had to relinquish to cover his debts. Marcus never had a close relationship with his father. According to author Colin Grant in his book Negro with a Hat, The Rise and Fall of Marcus Garvey, his paternal grandfather had been born into slavery, and the Garvey surname descends from Irish slave masters. As would be the case in his ascension, Garvey would always hold a special affinity for Ireland in his heart. As a young man, Garvey converted to Catholicism and began working jobs in Kingston, eventually becoming a labor union organizer. It would be after this when Garvey began seeing the path of his future political destiny. He involved himself in a protest to remove Governor Sidney Olivier from office to stop the migration of Indian people to the island for indentured work, who had began taking jobs from native Jamaicans. From this point, Garvey began publishing somewhat politically inspired writings and also entered himself into oratory contests to hone his skill set for public speaking. Marcus would come to befriend Joseph R. Love, a former anglicized clergy member of Trinity Church in New York, turned Pan-African propagandist, would become the mentor of Marcus Garvey. In 1911, after Jamaican labor hardships, Garvey moved to Costa Rica to work for the United Fruit Company as a timekeeper. From his station as timekeeper at United Fruit, he published a scathing newsletter criticizing the company's treatment of its laborers. Garvey then traveled around Central America for a few months before moving to London to further his political aspirations. While in London, Garvey would establish the connections to create the largest Back to Africa movement to this day. On the next episode of Boule, we discuss the most important events in the life of Marcus Garvey and how the relationships he fostered were essential in his breakthrough influence. We will also uncover the hidden lineages of some of the most prominent so-called black politicians in American history. On the next episode of Boule.
Back I never even heard of before was that the Boule is a 501c10. A 501c10 is 7 higher than a 501c3. In fact, this 501c10 says you don't even have to file a federal income tax for a 10-year period.